I'd also like to thank Eric Herman, who made significant contributions as we planned and launched the event. Ben Rader, our propaganda minister here at Knowlton. The Knowlton Foundation, who provided the funding that made this event possible through the Robert S. Livesey Professorship. I offer a hearty thank you to all of our online viewers, past, present, and future. And of course, a huge thank you to all the conference participants, whose brilliant intellectual efforts have made Blackboxing Banham not only a work of formidable scholarly significance, but also a hell of a lot of fun. Now, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. As has become our custom, I'll introduce each of the participants now, and we'll ask each speaker to pass the baton to the next at the conclusion of their presentation. Daniel Barber is Associate Professor and Chair of the Graduate Group in Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. His two-pronged research project foregrounds environmental issues to construct history of modern architecture and aims to construct a theoretical framework for architects and others to engage the climate crisis. He's the author of two important studies along these lines: A House in the Sun, Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War, and Modern Architecture and Climate, Design Before Air Conditioning. Our next speaker will be Jeanette Kim. Jeanette is an assistant professor of architecture at the California College of Arts in San Francisco and founding principal of the design practice, All of the Above. As a designer, researcher, and educator, she focuses on the intersection of ecology and social equity in the built environment. Her design and research work has been exhibited worldwide, from Oslo to New York to Beijing to Sao Paulo and more. Her many publications include The Underdome Guide to Energy Reform, written with Eric Carver. I'll also point out that Jeanette is a former faculty member of the Knowlton School, where she was the Lefevre Fellow in 2002-2003. Andrew Cruse is a current faculty member at the Knowlton School, where he's an associate professor of architecture. A registered architect, Andrew is principal, alongside Knowlton School director Dorothée Humbert, of Good Form Studio, which merges architectural and landscape strategies in projects including the Novartis Pharmaceuticals campus in Basel, Switzerland. Andrew's research focuses on the evolution of human comfort and its impact on architectural design and energy use. Prior to joining the Knowlton School faculty, Andrew taught at Washington University in St. Louis and was an associate at Machado Silvetti in Boston. Felicity Scott is professor of architecture, director of the PhD program in architecture, and co-director of the seemingly Soviet Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture program, CCCP, at Columbia University. She's an architectural historian and theorist whose work focuses on questions of techno-scientific, environmental, and geopolitical transformation in modern and contemporary architecture, art, and media. Her many publications include Architecture and Techno-Utopia, Politics After Modernism, Outlaw Territories, and Disorientations, Bernard Rudofsky in the Empire of Science. Now, following a panel discussion that will follow up each of the three presentations, we'll take a short break and return for closing comments from my co-conspirator in this endeavor, Michael Osman, who will be joined by Lucia Allais, Felicity, and our keynote speaker, Tony Bidler. Now that we're running, looks like about 20 minutes behind, so that schedule will bump back accordingly, so watch for that. In the interest of full disclosure, I'll point out that Michael, who I don't think we've properly introduced yet, is an associate professor and director of the MA PhD program at UCLA. As an architectural historian, Michael investigates connections between infrastructure and architectural modernism, with a particular focus on buildings and cities in the United States. His many publications include the 2018 book, Modernism's Invisible Hand, Architecture and the Regulation of America. So in short, we've once again got a serious collection of smarty pantses on our hands. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first smarty pants, Daniel Barber. Take it away, Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much for that set of introductions. I'm very happy to be here. Let me do this little dance. Okay. Okay, fabulous. So hello, everyone. Very, very happy to be here. Thanks again to Todd and Michael and all of the organizers and panelists and collaborators It's really been a rich and compelling set of discussions these last few weeks. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute and look forward to hearing, of course, from my co-panelists, from Felicity, and also to the summary comments just following. I want to thank in particular my colleagues who have offered a glimpse into their archivally rich and historiographically textured research into the enigmatic figure of Rainer Banham. My own comments will be more a set of reflections, considering the promise and pitfalls of reading with Banham in the context of the swirling and intensifying opportunities for reimagining architecture in its capacity to reshape social and geophysical dynamics today. I'll be honest, I'm a little nervous, not just because we had a recent power outage, my internet's a little spotty, I hope it all works out. But in working up to this and preparing a more standard paper on some absences in Banham's work, a figure whom, of course, I know as well as the next architectural historian, but about whom I have in fact written very little, I was struck simultaneously by the richness of ideas and cases he brought to our attention, so well articulated in the past few sessions, and also by a certain fatigue on my part with the enigma of Banham as a figure, both so much an outsider, a novel voice, always interesting and with such clever writing, and also now so squarely canonized. If I can borrow without permission Dora Epstein-Jones's fabulous phrase from the opening night, I'm a bit bothered by Banham, and bothered as well by talking about Banham with you today on a Saturday in a pandemic, amidst ongoing strife and loss, amidst unrest around glaring racial inequities, issues that our own discursive inside in our studios and classrooms, in our texts, exhibitions, conferences, and discussions, and inside we are struggling to pry open. I've been spending some time these last few months ruminating and writing on the past and future of our profession, the potential role for architectural history amongst the triple pandemics of COVID, climate, and white supremacy. For better or worse, I'm taking this fatigue, exposing some of these ruminations as the sort of background and somewhat the substance of my comments today, if nothing else, an attempt to clear away some of the fog of isolation. So I'm hoping to do a few things in the next 20 minutes or so, something of a stock taking, if you will, though not as systematic or structured as Banham's stock taking from 1960, nor even of Tony Vidler's taking stock in log in 2013, to which many assembled here also contributed, not as systematically, perhaps somewhat unfairly, certainly a bit impressionistically. I want to sort of operate on two channels, right? The images scrolling by as I talk will, I hope, suggest at least taking stock of some aspects of architectural research on the environment, mostly in the US, although here not, as they might have been cataloged around 1960. These images emerge out of my own archival research, known to some here, research and books that were in no small way inspired by the absences in Banham's own analyses, confounded by them, indeed. Research that has aimed to examine and explore an archive of architectural environmentalist activities contemporaneous to Banham's critical and historical writing, but that were, as far as I have been able to tell, outside of his view. Outside of architectural history, even one as enigmatic and as Banham's, as focused on the machine and the environment, and outside to his ambivalent inside, seen reflected in reverse through these glass walls in their many variations. These are buildings, plans, and processes which could be loosely grouped as solar and climatic, two different temporal and regional types of the glass facade. One, the solar version, that sees in this glass wall, ideally multi-paned and therefore somewhat insulated, an opportunity to let the sun in for seasonal radiative heating. The other, climatic, that aims to stop that radiation at the right place, as the bioclimatic methodologist Victor Ogiai put it in 1953, that is, block the sun, as in this building by SOM from 52, block the sun before it enters the building, managing seasonal and diurnal radiation through shading devices and thermal mass, among other architectural means, rather than through the mechanical equipment of air conditioning and ventilation. These are drawings, trends, developments, technologies, instruments, aspects of an environmental architectural history that is increasingly being revealed far, far beyond the limitations of my own research. Also in the work, just to name a few, of Jiahui Cheng, Hannah LaRue, Anna Osaki, Daniel Ryan, Johan Lage, Dalal Al-Sayer. I could certainly go on. A broader current of architectural environmental objects and ambitions emergent in this literature. Of course, many at this conference as well, bringing in some other voices. One aspect of this survey passing by is to reiterate some of the discussions from the technologists last Saturday. In particular, both Keel's and Forrest's lament that design students interested in environment still rely on Banham as an essential reference. The sort of collective misapprehension that my research, and that is some of those just listed, has aimed to redress. I might parenthetically add the figure of Buckminster Fuller. I'd say at about 75% of the public lectures I've given, including at Knowlton some years ago, the first question tends to be in reference to Banham or Fuller, Banham and Fuller, a sort of oscillation, Banham, Fuller, right? So on reading Banham and discovering so much archival evidence outside of what suddenly seemed like an inside, I was compelled across this inside-outside divide, glass-walled or otherwise, this glaring set of exceptions and complications to frame him, and not claiming here any novelty, as a figure primarily ambivalent, somehow both an obstacle and a facilitator of environmental historical research in the field, giving us a chance today to consider these boundaries, conditions more generally. As Vidler reminded us now a few weeks ago, Banham's outsider status was well earned, coming up as a grammar boy in the midst of a relative democratization of education, though, as the appellation suggests, with no attempt at gender parity, nonetheless in a moment when the starkly drawn lines of the British elite were rendered a bit more porous. An outsider then, finding himself inside, willing to don the bow tie when needed, but we have been assured, never quite comfortable wearing it. This positioning on the outside looking in, or on the inside, but frigid or overheated or somehow uncomfortable, this also, of course, operated historically and historiographically, perhaps foremost in one of Banham's first stones thrown in the Machine Aesthetic essay of 1955, in which he argued that, quote, the machine aesthetic of the pioneers of the modern movement was selective and classicizing. It came nowhere near an acceptance of machines on their own terms and for their own sakes, end quote. Seeing critically and as contingent what others, indeed his mentors, had accepted, not just pushing on familiar narratives, but also posing spectacular alternatives. Back to Fuller, of course, the futurists and some others. I expect that no small number of us here, myself included, were drawn to Banham, at least in part, because of this ambivalent outsider elan, perhaps at first willfully ignoring, then coming to terms with the strategic brilliance of this play, of an apparent derailing of the narrative that was still so clearly lodged in one of its centers. It became a method. If Banham was disruptive in his moment, his dissertation, nonetheless likely sold more copies than many of our academic books combined. His performance of outsiderness, like most modes of passing, is rooted in both experience and aspiration. Another telling essay brings this home, so to speak. The Master Builders, published in the Sunday Times supplement in August of 1971, was concerned first with the California bungalows of Green and Green, emphasizing their own four determinants of architecture, quoting Banham quoting the Greens, climate, environment, materials, and habits and tastes, end quote. Certainly sounds promising. It was the essay, The Master Builders, was a sort of preview of the Los Angeles book. In the essay, Banham credited Rudolf Schindler as having invented what he called, in reference to the color of the walls, quote, the white architecture of the 20s, at the same time as his European contemporaries and quite independent of them, end quote. Schindler did so in the stream that the Green brothers had navigated, widening it to a river. Climate was the site of Schindler's innovation. To quote Banham again, if one sets up the Schindler Chase House, as Banham wrote, next to the Greens' Gamble House, then the first and most fundamental contrast lies in their response to the immensely habitable California climate. The Gamble House, in spite of all those terraces and sleeping porches, is still a pretty compact block-like concept in which indoors and out are still identifiably different. Not so the Schindler House, which seems to take blocks of that climate and fold itself loosely around them, unquote. A loosening of the material distinctions, a suggestion that despite, or at least alongside the fascination with bubbles and equipment, megastructures and ecologies, the best way to live was with no walls at all. I'll come back to this in a moment. Another set of barriers, however, this time intellectual or perhaps ideological, was his real target in the Master Builder's essay. This achievement, to quote Banham again, now back in reference to Schindler's prescient or proto-modernism, again quoting, this achievement punches such a hole in the accepted Europe-centered view of the rise of modern architecture that it actually threatens the livelihoods of some professional academic architectural historians. And there is quite a busy little sub-industry at work, I'm still quoting, of course, quite a busy little sub-industry at work desperately trying to find ways of disproving Schindler's precocious originality. Lay readers, Banham continues, may find this difficult to credit, but the US architectural industry in a bad mood can resemble a Madison Avenue novel in its bitchiness, neurosis, and insecurity. Forgive me if I risk myself being accused of embodying all three this afternoon. This industry, such as it is well represented here today by myself as much, if not more, than many others. The vast majority of those presenting and moderating trained and or teach in the Eastern time zone. And in the shadow of this odd, and do so in the shadow of this odd yet pervasive genealogy of figures, individuals more than schools or collectives, who have shaken up the discourse and then often with a wry smile, watched it fall back into place. I'll just reiterate to be clear, this is the glass house that I live in myself, right? Was professionally raised in. And this is also the house at which I am lobbing a few stones, or not really, more like pushing a few pebbles off a bespoke marble countertop to see if they bounce around a little and cause a hairline crack. And here is Banham, both decrying a Eurocentrism in contrast to the Austrian emigre Schindler, and also decrying the professional academic architectural historians, of which he was at least part-time amongst. This ambivalence, perhaps a duality, an attempt to straddle, has of course been part of his appeal. I belabor this at some length because this line between the inside and the outside of the field, of who is in and who is not, its audience and resonance, because this boundary between inside and outside has never been more charged. Never has it been more clear that a disciplinary and discursive line around equity and exclusion or inclusion is reiterated and renegotiated in every conference, in every classroom, every dissertation, article, or publication. Indeed, unless we willfully and even aggressively push against it, poke holes in it. Even Banham's outside, and to an extent many of our own, are themselves, of course, still very much inside. A chilling reflection of the stark whiteness of our field and the figures many of us study. Perhaps also an openness, a prying open, an attempt to render porous this barrier, not so much to let others in through some collective benevolence of the elite, but rather a conscious and unflappable release of the gatekeeping aspects of publishing, editing, and admissions that has kept that inside so in for so long. So a lament, but also an opportunity to recognize how much more exciting and dynamic our field, by which I mean not only the specialist field of Banham studies, but architectural history more broadly, as it expands in case studies, geographies, concepts, and frameworks. One of the specific consequences of these two issues that I have foregrounded, that of both the inside-outside figure and that of Banham as a cipher for environment, in architecture, is the emergence of a permission structure for framing a conception of environment as green, sustainable, resilient, with striking little attention, even today, to the environment itself. A set of metrics or cultural aspirations by which climate is taken, again, not on its own terms, as Banham might have had it, but as another opportunity for the computational production of novel form. With good reason. Of course, the terms of the climate emergency, or really of the no more carbon imperative, would very likely and very quickly lead to another imperative for no more new buildings at all. A prospect that could just as easily be seen as an opportunity, a degrowth industry, focusing architects on retrofit and on reimagining existing buildings, but generally speaking, is not. This is in part to say that without, of course, claiming any causal relationship, we can mark the appearance of the Well-Tempered Environment book in 1969 as more or less simultaneous with the triumph of air conditioning and building industry supply chains, with the consolidation of the global purview of ASHRAE standards, and as a sort of alibi for the relative invisibility, not only of the equipment itself, but also the cultural richness of climate as a topic of design analysis. Again, some in the examples we have been seeing. The Well-Tempered Environment book's publication just preceded the brash xenophobia of the Ehrlich's population bomb and the Meadows limits to growth analysis, two texts known to many here, which established their own inside and outside and marked the West and the North as the space of environmental cleansing, while, quote, the rest of the world, as the environmental historian Joan Martinez Allier has memorably put it, while the rest of the world has had to deal with the effluence of the affluent, end quote. A framework all the more potent on the terms of climate instability and its uneven effects. The proverb, those who live in glass houses should not throw stones, for what it is worth, is attributed first to Chaucer in 1385, leaving some lingering questions about the genealogy of the glass house that are somewhat cleared up in Benjamin Franklin's 1736 version, which I quote, "Don't throw stones at your neighbors if your windows are glass," unquote. The proverb thus suggesting that those who are themselves vulnerable, that is, in a glass house, should not threaten others, lest their vulnerability be used against them. Our own fragile house, the academic establishment, if you will, sorry, I'm getting a note that my sound might have gone out. Is that, are we okay? No, okay. So I'll continue. If I remember where I was. Okay, our own fragile house, the academic establishment, if you will, now the reflecting screens of Zoom life, is of the least vulnerable amidst the stark inequities of this pandemic. At the same time that the calls, again, have never been more loud to break down these walls. If I dare make an elision between our little industry and the academy writ large, we can look to Leslie Loco's recent text in the Journal of Architecture, noting along with her that, quote, "Whilst little has changed inside the academy, so much has changed outside of it," to continue. Her continuing to quote Loco, "The academy has become a fragile condition where, aside from corporate statements, blacked out Instagram squares, and uncomfortable Zoom gatherings, the real vehicles of change, canon and curriculum, remain untouched." A message made more potent given the number of us here, myself included, in positions of program administration, and perhaps all of us collectively able to look to Banham, among many others, for their capacity to reimagine such things as canons. Despite Banham's continued attraction as an apparent outsider, then, after this event, we can perhaps place him firmly on the inside, so that the stones we throw are, in effect, at our own house. Of course, here as well, Banham beats us to it. So one last example. In the House is not a home essay, Banham insisted that Johnson's glass house derived not from, quote, Ledoux and Malevich and Palladio, end quote, but from, to quote him again, the visual image of a burned out New England township in which the brick floor and standing chimneys were all that remained, end quote. Banham positions the glass house as one of the antitheses of the environment bubble, with an overwrought and poorly controlled mechanized architectural environment. Inching towards some of the examples we have been simultaneously surveying, Banham notes, quoting again, "The glass would be a bit of nonsense if the trees did not shade it," end quote, if some of the radiation were not blocked at Olgai's right place, that is, outside the house. Johnson's house, we have to nonetheless admit, in its mechanical system facade relationship, is more the template for the sealed and conditioned Class A office space and high-rise condos of the present, much more so, that is, than an environment bubble where a carefully shaded facade can be seen to be. Perhaps, as he wrote, still in reference to Johnson, quote, "The house would have been better off without its walls," end quote. an aspiration I hope we can, in our discourse and teaching, also aspire to. So thank you very much. I guess I'll stop sharing my screen and pass it on with much anticipation to Jeanette Kim.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for looking outside. I'm really excited by your talk. I'm going to share screen. So thank you so much to Todd and Michael for bringing us all together, and to Shreya for, I think, a very clever kind of display. I've titled my talk, Bubbles and Enclaves, Charmed by Risk, because I'm curious about the kind of outright glee that Banham expresses for the near miss, for the kind of opportunity to skirt danger. Banham's bubbles are just protective enough for its inhabitants to venture out into the world. And the enclaves of Los Angeles are just secure enough to allow Banham's Angelino to launch their, quote, pretty dream of urban homesteading, unquote. So both the bubbles and the enclaves select which risks to take. They isolate, soothe, and entertain what's inside while propelling a kind of liberating outward expansion. These enclosures stand still just long enough to allow new claims to flourish. As a designer, I've been working on the relationship between climate change and inequity. I focus on property as a site for speculation as well as wealth distribution, and as a site for stasis as well as change. So because of this, I'm interested in both the delight and the callousness of Banham's daring, and the way his enclosures mark land as a site for experimentation. So my goal today is to see how Banham's fascination with risk might unearth some assumptions, both inside Banham's black box as well as our own, about what is acceptable risk and who we are trying to protect. Part one, precarious enclosure. So for Banham, risk-taking is liberating. In the A Home is Not a House essay, the exposure that's enabled by the bubble hosts a kind of seductive countercultural vibe that's free of upper crust propriety. In Los Angeles, the architecture of four ecologies, freedom is embodied by the audacity of Western expansion, which allows one to be rid of possessions and adopt, quote, the ingenious and technical proficiency of the surfer or the hot rodder, unquote. So what makes this expansion possible to Banham is the homestead. Los Angeles is a kind of instant paradise, quote unquote, which, to quote Banham again, you just have to add water to and just keep on adding it, unquote. As Wouter van Stepout has written, Banham sees gizmos as colonization devices. They usher in, and now I'm quoting Banham again, waves of agrarian migration to transform hostile environments, unquote. So although Banham more overtly celebrates mobility, his stance is also deeply rooted in the right to access land. Banham's version of anti-consumerism is, in this sense, decidedly neoliberal. His bubbles and enclaves float narratives of personal liberation and entrepreneurialism while severing them from political contestation in the world that they venture out into. So Banham had to work really hard to resolve these kind of the liberating potential of these enclaves with their exclusionary tendency. And he did not make it look easy. He depicts Los Angeles as a quote, conglomeration of small villages, unquote, in which socioeconomic distinctions are stunningly, quote unquote, stunningly apparent on any topographic map. As Tony Vidler has brought to life, such acknowledgements include Banham's cheeky reference to Beverly Hills as a ghetto. He bemoans, quote, indifference to the needs of all communities except one's own, unquote. Which he describes as, to quote him again, the ugly backside of that free-swinging libertarian ethics that makes so much of Angelino life irresistibly attractive, unquote. So in true libertarian spirit, Banham finds no faith in planning mechanisms as a corrective, even though the fair, oh, sorry, this was supposed to be my map regarding the kind of small villages of Los Angeles. But regarding this question about planning mechanisms, even though the Fair Housing Act was passed just 3 days before 3 years before 4 ecologies, his examples of government action only demonstrate private greed and corruption. Instead, to Banham, the car is the only salve. Banham brushes off what he calls the, quote, disadvantages of Watts. And he's writing here 6 years after the riots. And he writes that, you know, despite these disadvantages, you could, quote, always drive next door and see tidy homes, yielding proof that even there, the plainsman's dream of urban homesteading can still be made real, unquote. Banham's suggestion that mobility can transgress segregation is strikingly resonant with school busing initiatives, which were sanctioned by the Supreme Court the very year 4 Ecologies came out. Another correction to exclusion that Banham puts forward is the liberating potential of access to land. Banham acknowledges that the platting of land unleashed, quote, psychotic forms of territorial perception, unquote, but thanks to unlimited land, quote, the dream holds still, even if somewhere like Watts shows how slender is the hold of this illusion, unquote. So, you know, even the kind of effervescent dream of the homestead to Banham is enough. So just as Banham imagines that his own environment bubble could be replaced by currents of air, and this is a point that Whitney also made on Thursday, I think to him, land is simply a precondition for experimentation. It's not the end goal in itself. And, you know, his fascination with the Malibu beach as a kind of free space, even despite its neighboring properties, suggests that for him, access is more critical than ownership.
Hey, Jeanette.
Yes.
Sorry, your slides are not advancing. Are they on a different monitor?
Oh, you're kidding. Okay, let me try
There
sharing
they are.
again. That's a shame. Is that working now?
Yes.
Okay. So what you just saw, so this kind of question of the bubbles and the enclosures of LA, and the kind of attempts to see the car and property as this kind of response to exclusion. And then, let's see, where was I? So, you know, regarding this idea that if land is this kind of platform for experimentation, Banham takes what I think of as a kind of vulgar delight, right? Discussing this kind of transient nature, or the kind of this sense that the land is just prone to disaster. So he describes like the presence of shifting riverbeds that could, quote, change course cataclysmically after an earthquake. And he celebrates these buildings on stilts, but not the ones on the right, as mountain croppings that can accommodate this precarity, that can allow landslides to tumble beneath them. Part 2, risk tolerance. So, you know, I'm a little bit wary about projecting contemporary questions too cleanly onto Banham's own context, but his fascination with enclosures that just weather whatever hazards befall them is, I think, relevant to the way that architects today make sense of climate risk. Banham's delight in disaster has remarkable similarities to theories of resilience planning today. So Peter Plagens famously savaged Banham for, quote, taking such delight in the outside perversities, slowly killing me, my friends, thousands I don't even know, and Los Angeles itself, unquote. 23 years later, after Hurricane Katrina, these posters were distributed throughout New Orleans. And this phrase, "stop calling me resilient," comes from Tracy Washington of the Louisiana Justice Institute, who rejected city leaders' condescending praise of residents' resilience as an abdication of responsibility for the root causes of Katrina's violence.
Jeanette,
But
I hate to jump in again, but I think the slides are still, now they're stuck again.
I wonder why. Oh, it does say sharing is paused. Bring your window to the front. I've never seen that before. Thanks for telling me, appreciate it. Okay. Is that working now?
Yeah, now we've got them.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
Great. So I think both in Pelagians and Washington, you can start to see this kind of contradiction that's embedded within resilience theory, right? There's this kind of scrappy and this embrace of scrappy opportunism combined with a complacency towards loss. As I'm sure you all know, resilience planning basically suggests that cities must bounce back from disaster. Resilience has captured the public imagination and has sparked action in cities, but it's also been denounced as a smokescreen for growth and gentrification. I would like to argue that a more nuanced vision of resilience must recognize that risk calls forth unique burdens and privileges for each of us. While humility is just the right tool to curb an excess of power, it's overabundant among those who are subjected to economic exploitation and racial and social inequity. Banham's indecent glee for disaster reflects his fascination with the liberatory power of risk-taking. Banham projected his own assumptions about a universal subject onto his spirited celebration of the liberal individual. This stance trivializes harm, and it fails to recognize that this ideal liberated subject actually requires quite a lot of help, not just from the standard of living package, but from the economic and legal armature that actually enabled frontier-style expansion in the first place. Part 3, enclosures exposed. So what kind of precarity is too much? What kind of legal and financial support is enough? I'd like to show you some of my recent work on property and sea level rise to explore how the charm of risk could perhaps be defined through the very armatures of collective concern. From 2017 to 2018, I participated in the San Francisco Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge, or RBD, which asked 10 international design teams to propose strategies for adapting to sea level rise. As you can see here, our team was led by AECOM, CMG, Landscape Architecture, the Berkeley College of Environmental Design, and my research lab, the Urban Works Agency at CCA, which I co-direct with Niraj Bhatia. We also worked with partners in city agencies and community-based organizations. So in deep East Oakland, where we worked, the challenge's framing of resilience was received very warily by our community partners. And for very good reason. Oakland has had far too much experience with resilience. Its residents are well-versed in bouncing back from the exodus of manufacturing jobs, redlining, the demolition of public housing, and the pending redevelopment of the Oakland Coliseum. Despite this legacy, our partners, including the Oakland Climate Action Coalition and the East Oakland Collective, were themselves holding up the banner of resilience. And they did so with a focus on measures like flood-tolerant landscapes, community-owned solar farms, and collective homeownership. These projects construct access to land and resources, not because of the dream that it evokes or because of the individualism that it enables, but because it has a capacity to build collective wealth. So as designers, we especially wanted to see how access to and ownership of land could support these efforts, especially considering the legal and financial mechanisms that constrain them. But in the context of climate change, the concept of property is itself at risk. If property once promised protection from risk, the cost of protecting and insuring it from floods in fact, gives those with capital ever more leverage over those who are burdened by debt. So in essence, this makes property itself a kind of risk of its own. Similarly, if property once promised exclusive control over land, title action makes it really impossible to escape one's neighbors. This study on the right was done by coastal engineers Ruo Tian Wang and Mark Stacey and others, who show how the construction of levees around isolated urban enclaves actually accelerates erosion of others downstream. So as rising tides erode shorelines and property lines, this question of who pays, who benefits, and who bears the burdens of climate change remains deeply unresolved. Indeed, our team found, for example, that the threat of rising groundwater in deep East Oakland is extensive throughout the neighborhood. It's not just a shoreline condition. This research was especially led by our team member, the landscape architect, Christina Hill, who proposed that we basically express groundwater in lagoons that could then host floating structures. So we crossed this idea with the collective ownership that has been championed by our partners to imagine a community land trust that could couple flooded land with dry and new construction with old. As all CLTs do, this could take housing off of the speculative market. And because CLTs own land collectively and buildings individually, residents could, for example, move into new housing that's built on site, even as groundwater dramatically reshapes the kind of overall existing urban context. I'll speak less about this today, but this idea eventually fed into our team's proposal, which is called the Estuary Commons, which proposed a kind of loop of waterfront landscapes that are widened to accommodate floods and stepped back to allow the accretion and migration of marsh habitat along its shores. And then a kind of second element was this kind of patchy assembly of tidal ponds and CLTs that I just described. And together, this project builds on this idea that is described by legal scholar Caterina Pistora, among others, that the ownership of land is not an absolute right, but rather a tenuous set of entangled obligations. So since RBD wrapped up, I've been doing some alternate drawings, or some drawings of alternate property arrangements. I've been both inspired and frustrated by this shearing layers diagram by Stuart Brand. Brand describes how buildings change over time in a way that's staggered. So its structure might have a lifespan of 300 or more years. Its skin changes maybe every decade, and the space plan changes at the whim of its inhabitants. Importantly, Brand calls the site eternal. He does not recognize that a site is transient. And I think it's really his libertarian politics, which resonate with Banham's own, that are kind of the focus of this, because the focus on individual power for Brand suggests that he does not see the site as a place for political contestation. So, if we imagine that such isolationist tendencies would prevail, we might just simply see more and more water. But to counter this tendency, I've reapplied Brand's shearing layers diagrams back out to the city. I began by redrawing the diagram to kind of peel apart layers of the site. So sidewalks, roads, sand dunes, wetlands, and utilities, for example, might each in turn have their own rate of change, as well as their own set of beneficiaries and benefactors. To then play off of this further, I set up 5 speculative scenarios, many of which were in our RBD proposal, which which depict innovative financial and legal models and kind of spatially reshape these risks and rewards of ownership. So the first is a value capture policy approach, which basically can tax future development profits, which are indicated in dotted lines, and then redistribute these funds back into the neighborhood. So for example, a participatory budgeting process could direct those funds to, say, infrastructural shoreline improvements or a community kitchen, for example. The second property scenario is a community-owned solar project. I've used color to signify ownership. So the yellow zone here shows how different rooftops might be accessible to community-owned solar, for example, and then start to form connections across different properties. The third scenario is the application of what's called the public trust doctrine, which defines government ownership according to the location of the mean high tide line. So here I've imagined what might happen if corners of urban blocks were ceded to city ownership, which could, for example, start to link urban creeks, or maybe more importantly, even repatriate land for indigenous use. Fourth is a community land trust, as I just described before, but shown here with collective ownership in yellow and individual ownership in red and blue. And the fifth and last scheme is based on the use of crowdfunding platforms to basically fund real estate investment. So if someone, for example, could buy a smaller, flexible fragment of a larger structure to build up equity over time. Across these 5 scenarios, property is the critical instrument. Far from being a sanctuary from intrusive forces, property can also serve as a kind of dynamic, a malleable component of the city that can welcome in new custodians. I'm interested in this idea that it might be just the medium that can draw lines of inclusion among previously disinterested subjects, or spin off overbearing entanglements from those who are overburdened with risk. So I'll close with this thought, another kind of charm. To me as a designer, Banham's enclosures are most compelling in their depiction of this very tenuous threshold between protection and exposure. I think we can do without his breezy complacency towards the violence of urban exclusion and the frontier myths of the daring individual that ignores pressing political entanglements. But if we imagine the bubble as a series of layers, if we imagine the enclave as a field of competing shockwaves, then perhaps the question of what risks are acceptable and who bears them can be more carefully calibrated. So instead of universalizing the resilient subject or welcoming in all forms of transformative landscapes, some might, as Dora Epstein-Jones so powerfully said the other day, even claim the privilege of standing still. So alternative forms of ownership and access of land and resources can perhaps thus signal a different kind of charm, one that makes the outside world abundant and inclusive. All right, thank you. Andrew, I look forward to your talk. I think you're muted still.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jeanette, and then thank you, Todd and Michael, for the invitation, and just, I guess, a general thanks to all of the participants for their provocative presentations. Banham's not someone who I've looked at in a while, and there's certainly been a lot to go over this last couple of weeks. Okay, so the well temperament of the architectural environment. Considering Rayner Banham's The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment, architects and historians have generally focused on the nouns, architecture and environment, while ignoring the adjective well-tempered. What might Banham have meant by this term that figured so prominently in the book's title? In fact, he had very little to say about it. In the final chapter of the first edition, Banham described the difficulty of defining well-temperament generally including the aspect that I want to consider here, thermal comfort. His hesitancy to consider comfort is captured in a nearly paragraph-long sentence that begins, "The recognition there are no absolute environmental standards for human beings." In describing the difficulty of clarifying comfort, Banham had absolved himself from addressing sticky professional, political, and scientific questions that linked his beloved machinery to metabolism, meteorology, and meaning. For him, comfort was a black box he chose not to open. 15 years later, in the second edition of Well-Tempered Environment, Banham repeated the same paragraph. During those 15 years, scientists, engineers, and architects made significant contributions to thermal comfort research, theory, and practice. Today, I want to look inside the black box of comfort to outline two different understandings of well temperament that loosely correspond to the two editions of Banham's book. In accepting comfort as a black box, Banham largely ascribed to the first understanding, a deterministic approach strongly associated with a great gizmo of air conditioning. In doing so, he missed a second understanding of comfort that was tied to messier social and psychological mechanisms. The second approach was more political, and as Anthony Vidler described in his opening address, Banham preferred to avoid politics, even when dealing with overtly political topics. This remove may have blinded Banham to the impact of non-technical developments in environmental control, particularly those that occurred outside of the temperate American and European contexts he so often addressed. Yet rather than an anachronistic critique of a 50-year-old book, I want not to bury Banham, but to praise him. Well, his motivating concept, his belief in and in fact excitement for the technology of environmental control may not have aged well. The connection he made between architecture and environment is something for which we owe him his due. For indeed, Banham's lack of attention to well temperament is something that still pervades the practice, teaching, and the writing of architecture. In saying there was no absolute environmental standards for human beings, Banham was perhaps unwittingly echoing the view held by the premier professional society that conducted comfort research, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, or ASHRAE. From its inception in 1894, ASHRAE prioritized the definition of comfort as a way to demonstrate publicly the mechanical engineer's expertise. Starting in the 1920s, ASHRAE conducted some of the first laboratory-based comfort studies using climate chambers. Climate chambers were windowless rooms in which temperature and humidity could be tightly set and precisely controlled using sophisticated air conditioning technology. By 1924, ASHRAE published the first comfort chart showing a comfort zone for people. Despite the certainty of this chart, as ASHRAE continued conducting research over the following decades, the recommended comfort parameters became, paradoxically, less certain. The same chart from 1960 shows that ASHRAE's clearly defined comfort zone had disappeared. The chart was accompanied by a long list of qualifications and caveats related to clothing, climate, and habit that further weakened the chart's utility. ASHRAE's leadership, recognizing that they needed a clear understanding of comfort or they risk losing credibility in the eyes of their members, clients, and the public. Salvation from this atmospheric ambivalence came from the Danish engineer P.O. Fanger, who spent a sabbatical year working at the ASHRAE-sponsored Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Kansas in 1966. It was there that Fanger developed what is today the most commonly used thermal comfort index, the predicted mean vote, or the PMV. In developing this index, Fanger continued the physiological basis of early ASHRAE research that equated comfort with heat balance. This approach assumed that when the heat produced by a body's metabolism balanced with the air in a room, people were comfortable. Like ASHRAE, Fanger based his research on laboratory work in climate chambers, both the one in Kansas and the new chamber he built on his return to Denmark in 1968. Shared specifications for such chambers ensured the reproducibility of experiments that was a cornerstone of the scientific method. Building new chambers allowed researchers to develop an international network of laboratories focused on their shared project. As the name suggests, the predicted mean vote allowed mechanical engineers to predict how building occupants would vote on a scale of thermal sensation so that they could create such conditions with the building's air conditioning system. It was a utilitarian approach that provided the greatest satisfaction for the greatest number. The ability to predict ideal comfort conditions had clear commercial advantages for ASHRAE. Fanger recognized this in his book, Thermal Comfort, where he wrote, "Thermal comfort is the product which is produced and sold to the customer by the heating and air conditioning industry." While Willis Carrier is commonly considered the father of air conditioning for his technological development and advocacy, Fanger deserves to be considered at least an uncle for establishing a clear commercial basis for air conditioning's widespread use. The PMV represents what is called in a very Banham-esque turn of phrase, a zookeeper mentality, in that the building owner sets the interior comfort conditions that all building occupants had to accept. Although the first edition of the Well-Tempered Environment predates the official formulation of the PMV index, Banham's air-conditioned examples embody the ambitions the standard expressed, even as he failed to recognize how such technical systems affected building users. To cite one example, Banham discussed the Millam Building, the first American office building with central air conditioning. While he carefully analyzed the building's ductwork and equipment, he missed the prohibition in the leasing agreement that prevented occupants from opening their office windows because the weather outside interfered with the proper functioning of the air conditioning. Almost from the time it was announced, Fanger's PMV index had its critics. By the time the second edition of the Well-Tempered Environment appeared in 1984, this group had coalesced in their support of an adaptive thermal comfort model. There were significant differences between the predictive and adaptive comfort approaches. While the PMV was based on laboratory research in climate chambers, adaptive researchers used field studies in existing buildings to determine comfort preferences. This focus on field work was influenced by military research in extreme physiology, biometeorology, and environmental psychology. Adaptive comfort researchers preferred field studies because of their experiential realism. By surveying people in the spaces where they lived, learned, and worked, researchers collected more accurate data than could be found in a laboratory. Using field study results, adaptive comfort researchers identified what they called a climate signal. That is, a connection between the outdoor climate and indoor comfort expectations. Unlike the PMV's deterministic heat balance logic that was based on mechanical equipment, the climate signal showed that the weather outside played an important role in shaping comfort inside. Furthermore, the adaptive approach saw building occupants not as passive recipients of a building's artificial climate, animals in a tightly sealed thermal zoo, but as active agents in shaping their own comfort, more like a Montessori teacher approach. Although there are many examples of such choices, from putting on a sweater to moving across a room, the most commonly discussed one was opening a window, allowing interior and exterior climates to mingle. The adaptive approach did not disprove the PMV, but showed that the PMV lost its predictive ability in naturally ventilated buildings. In connecting indoor comfort to exterior climate, adaptive comfort researchers looked beyond the temperate regions and residents that had dominated PMV work. In a sense, adaptive comfort decolonized comfort, and that it looked at tropical contexts and highlighted how different climates, populations, buildings, and economies contributed to comfort. Starting in the 1980s, work on tropical comfort began in Japan and soon spread elsewhere in Asia. Rapid economic development in ASEAN countries, including Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, led to the increasing use of air conditioning and related increases in energy demands. Adaptive comfort researchers began to focus on the tropics, and what they found there challenged the universality of Fanger's PMV approach. Although it's easy to rebuke Banham for his tone deafness to the sociopolitical context of tropical comfort, I find one example particularly jarring. After repeating the idea that there are no absolute environmental standards, Banham describes a recent situation, this is in 1969, where British troops in the colony of Aden were accused of, quote, subtly torturing Arab detainees by deliberately running the air conditioning at full cool. Banham goes on to explain that maybe the soldiers just had a different comfort expectation than their prisoners, and they didn't really mean to hurt the poor chaps. Instead, it may be more accurate to call this full cruel rather than full cool, as the British military was known to use so-called ice water cures as torture techniques. Similarly, Americans had used full cool air conditioning on cells of civil rights protesters in Mississippi and on North Vietnamese POWs in Saigon. In this situation, Banham sees more like a bumbling Sergeant Schultz of architectural history who sees and hears nothing wrong in what those cheeky soldiers were getting up to. Such inattention may have cost Banham and those who looked at him as a reliable narrator of their well-tempered environment, in that he missed the architectural opportunities offered by a more adaptively defined idea of comfort, what are called mixed mode buildings. In the simplest sense, mixed mode buildings used both air conditioning and natural ventilation to create comfort. Although many early air-conditioned buildings with operable windows can be considered mixed mode, the concept was first consciously formulated by the English engineer Max Fordham. Fordham, 10 years Banham's junior, had a relatively posh upbringing in London and the Caribbean. He completed a degree in natural history at Cambridge, where Leslie Martin, architect of the Royal Festival Hall, suggested he work in the developing field of building services. Fordham was one of the earliest employees at what would become Arup Associates. There, his innovative approach to building systems mirrored that of Ove Arup's to structure. Fordham proposed three types of mixed mode buildings: concurrent, changeover, and zoned. Concurrent buildings had air conditioning and natural ventilation in the same space, and the two modes could be used simultaneously. Changeover buildings changed between air conditioning and natural ventilation, typically based on seasonal variations, but they could also respond to shorter term changes. Finally, in zone buildings, some spaces were exclusively air conditioned and others exclusively naturally ventilated. Occupants could move from climate to climate within the same building. The mixed mode idea has been slow to catch on, but the number of mixed mode buildings is growing. When the adaptive comfort research community first collected their field studies into a database in 1997, there were only 3 of the 160 buildings were mixed mode. The current database, which includes 80,000 field experiments, has about 12,000 studies from mixed mode buildings. Such buildings represent important examples of the well-temperament of the architectural environment that deserve more attention within our climate-constrained and comfort-impoverished world. They throttle down Banham's equipment bias while renewing his iconoclastic and image-rich approach to architecture as environment. Before concluding, I want to show a few examples of mixed mode buildings in Australia. This is a somewhat idiosyncratic choice. There are mixed mode buildings lots of places, but it's a context that I'm familiar with and where there's been a wide range of examples, in part because of Australia's unique architecture culture, climate, and its atypical uptake of air conditioning. The Lend-Lease House by Harry Seidler on the right predates the official formulation of mixed mode, although it can be described as a concurrent building with both air conditioning and operable windows. It's an example of the climatic modernism that Daniel Barber recently described in his book, Modern Architecture and Climate, Designed Before Air Conditioning, only this building was air conditioned. Banham must have been aware of the building as it was completed in 1961, the year he traveled to Australia as keynote speaker to the Australian Architectural Convention in Sydney. That same year, Banham wrote the introduction for Seidler's monograph that contained Lend-Lease House. The book was published by Horowitz, whose aluminum screen, naturally ventilated offices Seidler had also designed. Australian universities were quick to embrace the mixed mode approach as an energy-saving strategy for their campuses. The formally and materially constrained Red Center at UNSW, Mitchell, Jurgala, and Thorpe is a zoned building with naturally ventilated classrooms and air-conditioned computer rooms. The more recent and more exuberant Swaston Academic Building at RMIT by Lyons is organized as a vertical campus with conditioned classrooms and offices opening onto naturally ventilated atrium and informal student areas. And finally, although international standards for commercial real estate often require tight temperature ranges achievable only with air conditioning, a number of mixed-mode Australian office buildings combine design innovation with corporate virtue signaling. The National Bank of Australia, by BVN, has a W-shaped plan with air-conditioned offices along a north-facing, naturally ventilated space they call a veranda. There, sunrooms and winter gardens serve as break and meeting spaces. The more recent Barrack Place in Sydney by architects Hassel and Arup is in a dense urban neighborhood. Its conditioned office spaces are organized around a naturally ventilated open work and circulation area. There are many more architecturally innovative mixed mode buildings that remain largely unrecognized for their approaches to comfort, but I'll have to save that for another talk as I need to conclude. From the time it first appeared, critics saw Banham's well-tempered environment as path-breaking yet deeply flawed. Their reviews captured this ambivalence. James Marston Fitch called it a most significant piece of work, but one that was limited in scope and matter-of-fact in tone. Kenneth Frampton saw some seminal scholarship, but found that its emphasis on rationalization led to false consciousness. This trend continues as Michael Ossman and Todd Gannon have called it both a radical book and an abortive venture. Many of the participants in this symposium, including some people in this very panel, have also had similar ambivalent assessments. I think it is in part the tension of this ambivalence that keeps bringing architects and historians back to Banham and to this book. Beyond Banham's shortcomings, blind spots, and willful ignorance that an historical exegesis reveals, his examination of architecture's role in creating environments remains as important as it is incomplete. Comfort is an example of this. In focusing on comfort, it becomes clear that critiques of the well-tempered environment are also critiques of today's practices, both the practice of design and the practice of history. Like Banham's narrative, the norms and standards that often invisibly govern much contemporary work dictate an equipment-based environmental control. As noted comfort researcher Richard Didier recently lamented, a somewhat depressing deduction from the comfort research community is that instead of innovation in indoor environmental design assimilating our expanding knowledge of thermal comfort, the technology itself is driving our concepts and models. Revisiting the well-tempered environment is an opportunity to rescript an understanding of the relationship between architecture and environment. This is a shared project for history and design. Early ideas of well-temperament that were discredited by the emerging technology of air conditioning are now presented as a possible way out of our environmental predicament. Cracking open the black box of comfort offers opportunities, both performative and poetic, that we're only just beginning to realize that we may need. Thanks.
I will unmute myself. I thought I was going to be automatically unmuted. So just first also to reiterate thanks to Todd and Michael for inviting me to join in on this quite remarkable series of conversations, to join the various black boxes that it marks out, or boxing matches in some senses, and but also to thank the three panelists for really remarkable and very distinct but strangely sort of intersecting presentations, which I really appreciated. And I've got a bit of a task of juggling some of the things I thought about in advance when I was prompted to read A Black Box, The Secret Profession of Architecture, a text that had actually fallen out of my litany of Banham readings for many decades. And I have some questions about for myself about why that might have been. And then I obviously want to try and draw that into the specifics of what was presented today to the degree to which I can do that on my feet. And I think we have about 25 minutes to do this. And I guess, just to begin with, I really do appreciate Todd and Michael's framing of this series that, as Daniel and others have pointed out, really does point to the pervasiveness of Banham's presence in the North American Academy, or we could say actually many different versions of Banham's presence in the North American Academy as it operates actually across many generations, and as it reminds us both of the sort of allure, to some of his writings, and also its clear limitations, as Lucia pointed out the other day, and I think Andrew just reiterated, the sense that his concepts have not aged well, hence also the return of this trope of being bothered by Banham. And I think the question is whether that bothering is productive or not, how we're bothered and to what ends we deploy that bothering. And so again, just this question of why Banham now, or what is it about Banham that has haunted each of the speakers, or even the series as such, is an invitation to open up both the black box of the profession, what Banham refers to under this rubric of the sort of unspoken codes of a secret society in the black box text, but also to, and this was certainly pointed out in different ways today, to scrutinize architectural history's own institutional norms and sort of attitude-forming situations, both, let's say, within architectural history as a field and as it intersects in complicated ways with design. And I want to come back to this nexus of design and history that Andrew also ended on, which I appreciate and I think is actually really critical here. And so if we, inherit Banham, and so many of us do, then the questions at stake are, well, there's lots of questions, but one of them might be, how we deploy him to denaturalize the framing of the fields as much as the denaturalization of Banham's own legacy, and really to ask the question of if or whether we will be the last generation of Banham readers. And I think it's a big question, and I think it's a question that haunts the series. What do you do? What do you do with at times damaging and epistemologically violent legacies that nevertheless provoke a type of critical self-reflection in the field? Yeah, how do we actually reckon with that? And I will come back to this. But I wanted to begin with something like I don't know if we would say this, a mea culpa, or sort of self-indictment that was provoked in some senses by Forrest's remarks about how when he arrived at Princeton, all of the doctoral students asked him whether or not he had read The Well-Tempered Environment. And I think it's particularly sort of symptomatic of this tension between, tension, connect and disconnect, let's say, between the professional aspects of the discipline and the scholarly aspects, so to speak. I mean, scholarly in the sense of historical scholarship and how to think that. And I think, just to say really, it suggests that I needed also to acknowledge some of my own obsessions with Banham, the various ways in which and I'm going to be very brief about this, but it is a bit of a mea culpa, so you'll have to bear with me very briefly about my own bothering, which is to say that my very first publication, not at all something I'm proud about, that came out of an appalling graduate student paper at Princeton, was on Rainer Banham. My first book, The Architecture Techno-Utopia, opens or begins with a slightly troubled, but perhaps not troubled enough, reflection on Banham, a type of dialectic trying to think through the relationship of his techno-utopianism and his sort of liberalism, or increasingly, I think, neoliberalism. I think Jeanette is entirely right about that, what he himself cast as sort of inner contradictions or archaisms with his own type of apotropaic ways of positioning himself. And even, so I'm trying to work through, or trying to sort of think about Banham's own encounter with American capitalism and his mea culpas and his refusals to engage with some of the more visible historical struggles of the late 1960s and 70s. We still need to attend to this today. And Daniel very nicely opened around this very question. But I also, in a way, just was reminded by Jeanette's presentation that text I just recently finalized that is largely a text trying to indict Stuart Brand, also opens through Banham, and through Banham's reading of alternative networks for the alternative culture that talks about, quite literally promotes the potential of a third way between capitalism and Marxism, for which the Holl catalog and Brand himself stands as a type of model of creating an alternative, an alternative to what we need to ask, but an entirely, problematic version of that. And so the question of, why I too would return to Banham, despite all sorts of attempts of also escaping the norms of the field, is indeed incredibly haunting. And I think Daniel spoke to some of these points. There's certainly something appealing in the way that Banham seemed at certain points to mark an opening or an outside to certain norms of the discipline, in the figures like the Not Quite Architecture series, or sometimes even his heterodox position that spoke at different moments to, let's say, offered certain weapons to refusing whatever formalism, claims to disciplinary autonomy, there's all sorts of slightly seductive gestures in the work that are nevertheless so fundamentally insufficient. But this posthumously published text on a black box performs itself a type of call to order, a retreat to architecture that's a forceful reminder of the highly normative sort of institutions at work, even in Banham's own, slight modelings of points of escape. And it suggests that maybe many of his struggles were less a departure or dismantling than, yet other forging of boundaries around the discipline. And I think this inside-outside question is absolutely key to struggle with here. And is maybe sort of central to what this series of panels has been about, as is acknowledging what has been left out of the picture. And in this particular text, the black box text, Banham is calling for a lot to be left out. And this is particularly jarring. And so I'll try and actually come back to this more quickly, but the text, one of the moments in which he returns to these forms of exclusion is when he's recounting the story of Christopher Alexander's surprise at the instrumentalization of the patent language, looking like sort of late modernism, that nothing looked really any different. And so he effectively situates the architect, let's say, on the sort of prescriptive side of the equation, and scholars such as himself on something like the descriptive, the empirical as the figure that holds the key to opening the black box, the tools to opening the black box, to understanding something like how the architect works. This is one of the lessons of this remark. But the situation is much more complex, and this is, I think, what you've all spoken to today, but also to come back to the last environments panel, Keel's reading of the sort of epistemic damage of Banham's preoccupation with mechanical equipment and closed systems environment like space capsule, and the image-based training that he perpetuated, the argument that it led to a sort of legacy of environmentally sealed boxes and formal expression of mechanical equipment. Again, I think this is a long-winded way of coming back to how to think this relationship, because Banham's writing, it reminds us that the sorts of mythologies within design culture that he sets up to ridicule and to question are often perpetuated or, cycle back through the culture of history and criticism to produce a very powerful type of scripting of a future. And we know this sort of complicated relationship that is something like a feedback loop. And so, I point to this feedback loop to ask, what are the possibilities on both sides of this equation, whether they be designers or scholars, to operate in a manner that might be decidedly and knowingly out of sync. And Michael Usman brought a very different figure to bear, in the last conversation, which was to invoke the figure of collusion or even collaboration between historians and engineers and designers. But I wanted to just, in a way, ask each of you thinking, I don't know, I don't want to even posit it as a dualism, like I'm precisely suggesting it's one of the many dialectics that Banham both performs and breaks down simultaneously. But I wanted to ask whether collaborations or collusions, to give it a slightly different spin, do produce an opening to an outside, whether they would close it down even more. I want to ask, what type of dialectic might be a productive dialectic? And I ask this not only as historians grappling with Banham, but as designers grappling with Banham, or designers being taught Banham, if they are still taught Banham. And so, I wanted to just maybe, before I come back to the environment in more detail, just, I guess, sort of ask you to think about, what, and even your own self-positioning in relationship to Banham, or just how to best navigate that problem. Because again, historians and critics do have something of a privileged role in scripting, and yet it's also one that comes with a type of responsibility. It's one that is, closely implicated through pedagogy, through attention to the work of architects, through in all of these ways. It's like so thoroughly entangled. And so how to think the politics of this entanglement, or how to think the disciplines separately and together. I just wanted to get a sense if you had any, it's something I struggle with all the time, training both professional students and scholars in slightly different voices, like how to think Banham's legacy at this nexus. Like, what might you want to say at this point? I guess you should turn off your mute buttons, or turn on your microphones. That creates feedback. Because you're coming from different positions, obviously. So, Daniel, you're muted. Yeah.
Right. I was just saying that Andrew turned off his mic first, so he maybe wants to get us started, or. I can kind of play along for a minute, and without, at risk of sort of invoking again Forrest in his absence, I think also this kind of triangulation, not only of, let's say, the historian and designer, but the engineer or building scientist, right? One that of course was discussed last week as well, but I don't know if that had what that does to the dialectic perhaps, but I think one of the things, I've been kind of thinking through along those same terms. And first of all, thank you for such an amazing sort of rendition of these papers and bringing them together in such an elegant way. That was very nicely posed. And thinking a bit about, who could Forrest have suggested that these PhD students read, right? So if they say, "Did you read this?" he can say, "Well, did you read that?" Right? And it could be De Beer, it could be Fenger, it could be the old guys, and these sort of more technologically inclined. We can imagine Maldonado, even a potential sort of return of Bombas and James Wines and some of these other sustainabilists or something like that. But I think it's maybe precisely on the terms that you framed it, of a sort of out of syncness, right, that suddenly feels so in sync. And that's, this was part of my own kind of, not quite shock, but I don't know, just sort of looking agog at figures like the old guys who were so clearly enmeshed in this discussion that Banham seemed to be foregrounding, yet were completely absent, not only from his work, but from any historical or very most historical treatment, as we know, right? And so this question of sort of how maybe this dialectic is the kind of, and it's of course a familiar one to historians, a sort of archaeological process of sort of finding those figures that seemed out of sync in their moment, but yet have something to say to us today, not only about that moment, but about its potential legacies, right? And the sort of pulling out of other threads. Yeah, I don't know. I'll sort of stop there and let others jump in, but I think that that kind of dynamic might be useful.
I mean, I would say in terms of this, the question you raised about the politics of entanglement and teaching different contingencies, to me, part of the challenge is the rich visual language that Banham developed is so seductive and so easily understood in an environment where the sort of qualitative understanding of architecture through images is the main way that information is delivered, whereas a lot of this other information is from scientific papers and it's qualitative, or it's quantitative, and it comes in the form of charts and graphs. And it's like, you know, I'm thinking again, you know, Forrest had a slide of like a table full of charts and graphs. And it's like, to get any of this comfort information, those are the articles you need to read. And translating from one to the other is a difficult process. You know, that's why I think someone like Max Fordham, who is relatively new to me, is an interesting character. He's still practicing because he, you know, speaks both languages. He can translate from one to the other. And there are not a lot of people that are translators in that way. I think we still tend to be, you know, siloed or restricted by our own expertise, or, you know, wanting to speak to our own cohort at however you want to phrase it. And this sort of bridging between the two ways of learning, the two ways of communicating, sort of two ways of understanding goals is a perennial challenge.
And I definitely pick up on your question about translation. And I think in some of the work I've been doing, I could see that this question of collusion needs to connect to people who make decisions about urban policy, for example, or neighborhood activists who are arguing for a certain kind of power. So as we think about triangulating, maybe that's the kind of another outside that needs to come in. And then I wonder then, okay, so what's the language of that translation, or what the nature of that translation? And it's so true, right, that, you know, even the idea of a catalog, the idea of the pattern language, this is familiar. and I think we would agree that the kind of pitfall, one of the pitfalls of that might be this understanding that empowerment could be so easy, right? That empowerment could be so particularized. Mm-hmm. So then if we want to go further, and with that, I think, you know, with the catalog, we could also maybe bring in the best practices manual, or another attempt to translate, right? So I'm just also wondering about other forms of translation. You know, for example, do catalogs need to be empowered with, I don't know, connections to other kinds of power than what an individual can do? And does translation also need to involve, well, sure, certainly like critical capacity, right? That one would have questioning conversations with one's partners. But I'm also just wondering, and maybe this is where I still love Banham, that like maybe humor is sort of a useful translator, or the kind of strangeness or oddity that he brings forward could be useful. And I mean, it's funny, I hadn't read Banham in quite a while until this this week, but I just kept thinking that this felt like someone saying, you know, like, what's so funny? Don't you get the joke? You know, like there's this kind of like a kind of humor that pushes discomfort under the rug, right? Which is very different than a kind of humor which reveals absurdity or strangeness. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I guess I'm kind of arguing for or against Banham there, but I would love to see other forms of translation.
Andrew's potent example of you know, of even bringing humor to the question of the torture, you know, of Arab detainees. Like, I mean, and there's so many examples, more often sort of misogynist examples, often racist examples that Banham uses, you know, what were even at that time, one would have to imagine, things that one doesn't even want to, cite out loud to reference, people of other cultures, so how do you navigate that? Because the humor is seductive, and and that's in part where it's also dangerous sometimes, and so even the Barbarella text, has any number of moments in it where you sort of cringe, and so that incredibly complex space of reading Banham today, I take it also as a measure of historical distance from Banham's concerns as much as anything else, but also a type of call for caution to the degree to which so many of the concepts persist as well. And so, yes, that tension that makes him sort of important to read and incredibly complicated to read. This is a slightly different question, but I do have some other notes. But just to come back to what Jeanette just said, one of the questions I wrote down in listening to you talk, and it's a slight allegorization of your presentation, but goes something like, is architecture not itself a safe space, from which to take risks with respect to the conception of environments? Can architecture be a less safe space to think critically about stakeholders and different actors? Or, can one leave architecture further behind in order to actually engage, or would that be giving away too much? And this is not in any way intended as a critique of you, but it struck me also, around where Daniel ended up, pointing to the security of the academy, pointing to the security of architectural history in a way as a place from which to launch, various forms of experimental discourse or practice. And, so how do we, it's a huge question, because on the one hand, we could say, I always use this figure of not deterritorializing too fast, but on the other hand, it structures the question of responsibility in very particular ways, vis-a-vis, who our discourses are legible to, who their recipients are. And I'm not saying we all need to, or historians need to abandon the humanities. I think the humanities are actually incredibly important weapons. This is not my point, but I'm just asking, what is it to think environment and climate and risk from the perspective of architecture? To what degree does that retain a bracketing, no matter how complex the entanglements you seek to articulate are? Yeah, I don't know. I know that's a really, maybe a slightly unfair question, but it, it's a sort of a complicated one, because Banham, I'm totally, horrified by the neoliberal libertarianism that he celebrates. This is also what a lot of my work fights against, less in Banham than in many other aspects of my work. I think the reading of the homestead and the bubble and the way in which the architecture itself offers something like a proper place, seemingly without risk from which to experiment, and yet actually displacing that risk onto a whole series of other actors and agents is not that far removed from the question of what we say as scholars or critics, having real impact on the ground, like touching down through pedagogy on the world. And so it's this is where my safe space question came from. Are we maybe also not putting ourselves enough at risk in thinking about some of these questions, and what would it look like to do so? And I don't have even the beginning of an answer to that. I know we're running out of time, but I do have, I have two more questions, but maybe one of them I'll just try and mark out very briefly. And no, one I'll do very quickly, and then I'll go to my slightly longer question, which it struck me that environment remains in so many ways in much of the conversation here related to the natural world, the natural environment, nature, bodies, comfort, climate, and that the nature that Banham, the environment that Banham recognized and was grappling with was also, an environment written through by computers, by cybernetics. It was an environment that was governing a new, technologized society, governing subjects and environmental mechanisms that were so far from the domain of the natural, like scripting models of consumerism and all of these things. And so I was very struck by the largely the framing of environment in building environment and natural environment terms, and so minimally through information environments. And I don't know if there's I don't know if one wants to comment on that. But last, I'm trying to make this very brief, but I wonder how I'm going to do this. Maybe the quickest way to do this is to say something like, at a moment in architectural history, and maybe to some degree in architecture, and designers might want to agree with or disagree with me here, that we're more focused on bicycle sheds than cathedrals, so to speak. If we come back to that Blackboxing text, and so this is what's doubly disturbing in some ways about Banham sort of doubling down to into a sort of domain of Eurocentrism and tradition in that text, where he even points out that defining architecture as the progression of styles and monuments of the European mainstream from Stonehenge to the Stadsgaleria, might alleviate some confusion, or he alludes to the sort of the fact that we should stop trying to cram the whole globe into architectural history's intellectual portfolio, where he talks about the vulgar cultural imperialism that leads writers of general histories of architecture to co-opt absolutely everything built upon the Earth's crust into their subject matter. And so on the one hand, we might chuckle at his reading of architecture as a secret culture, or as an arcane and privileged aesthetic code that is bounded by Western culture in the Latin language. If we can laugh, and today we might also find this appeal to architecture being a sort of protected area of Western civilization as no laughing matter. Precisely to come back to this question of what needs to be further troubled. And we might recognize it, and Daniel alluded to this, as key to very structural forms of white privilege in the field, as a mark of its epistemological violence that really does warrant a significant dismantling. And it's somewhere in the complicated ways in which, when he ends on a remark about whether architecture was going to continue into the sort of profane and vulgar, where he would put other cultures, and he would put the environment, he puts both of those questions on that camp, or continue, and lead to a sort of closing of ranks and a conspiracy of secrecy, sort of doubling down on its secret value system to preserve its integrity and social regrouping, and to defend the contents of the black box at whatever cost. These are his words, and so I guess I have two questions there. Like, do we need to think those two together, the environment and the and the so-called non-European or Euro-American, and do we think that this type of defensiveness and doubling down still holds with the environment question, or do we think that the environment question, has become such a dominant discourse, as to be a new institutional center? And I know two different questions there, but again, this is what struck me as incredibly shocking rereading Banham's text, that toward the end of his life, whether it was to mark a retreat to the discipline, to keep architects' attention, like this sort of retreat into an architecture with a capital A, seeming without irony. I don't know if there was any editorial intervention that was published posthumously that we need to account for, but I know I've marked out a complicated set of terms here, not a particular question, but this really struck me in returning to that text, and just wondering why environment remained the outside that was sort of the good, and yet so many other things were so adamantly refused. So So I know that's maybe too complicated to even respond to in a couple of minutes, but you have thoughts.
I think at the risk of responding to your question with more outsides, it seems to me like I couldn't even possibly define what it would mean to put boundaries on an architectural disciplinary identity without even looking at, let's say, the way real estate intersects with it, right? And you couldn't even talk about architecture without understanding the market forces which impact it. And so for me, I am definitely someone who is always dabbling on the edges of the discipline, coming back to property for me was a way of coming back to what I consider to be core, actually. And precisely because that has never been a safe space in its very conception, and the very fact that it was not a safe space makes it so ripe to deal with. So I hope that answers, responds in a way.
I think that's a great response in this. I think in part helps us to recognize, and I think it's probably fair to say across the kind of sessions that we've been witnessing the past few weeks, that this is a kind of specific, not one specific necessarily, but let's say a non-normative version of the architecture, not only that we see in the schools, but certainly in the practice. And we're talking about these outsides and insides. We're kind of dancing around these peripheries, and so I think there's some hesitance in trying to speak too directly to the kind of discipline itself in this context. But I do just want to very quickly pick up on this question of the image and translation. And I think even some of those questions of environment, environments, computational environments, and really, start to recognize how, I think this sort of premise that the image should be simple or legible, or is this kind of site of translation, feels like a missed opportunity, right? I mean, like that maybe there's a capacity, and this is maybe back to this collusion collaboration set of questions of, have we overinvested as a field in the clarity of image making and in the kind of, allure again, or the pleasure even of those images that are produced, whether by, the developer producing the next glass tower in Manhattan, or the technologist in Germany figuring out all the reds and blue arrows that are moving around and kind of making their building perform, right? These images tend to maybe shut down discussions rather than open them up, right? And so I guess I'm increasingly interested in the kind of, which we also have many histories of, the kind of process-oriented image-making practices that maybe allow different points of intersection, be they with the aim of educating developers or communities or architects or others, right? But a kind of disruption of that simplicity of the image as a site for a more, for a different kind of translation. I don't want to add a value to it inherently, but for a different kind of conversation, right? That might lead to, some novel passageways to a different kind of future, I suppose.
To follow up on that a little bit, one thing, Daniel, I liked about your recent book was this discussion of the technical image and how that as sort of an object of discussion, and wondering, okay, so what is the role of that today? Most of the technical images you talked about were sun, and sun angles translate geometrically very easily into architectural form. Whereas the challenges that we're facing today are more aerosol images, which don't. There certainly were lots of studies of blowing smoke over shapes, but those never seem to make it any further than the laboratory pictures. So also wondering, maybe to your question as well, Felicity, about this question of environment as a sort of other or something apart, reading Banham in the age of the Anthropocene, if we still use that word, it's like putting him in an entirely different context where the environment is no longer outside, but it's everywhere. And the images that once told us something about this, the technical images that once told us something about this outside are no longer seem meaningful in the way they once were. I'm interested in this idea of process image. I haven't heard that before.
I'm a notoriously bad timekeeper, so I'm going to turn it over to Todd here to rescue us.
Well, this has been really great. It's true, we're running behind because of some technical difficulties. I would say this has been a really fascinating conversation. One of the things that I've been equally fascinated by is that the chat is quite lively on YouTube, and my phone has been buzzing away with text messages through this entire thing. So for all of what we're discussing, we really are inhabiting the architecture of the multi-platform environment. And I just want to share very quickly before we move away, a comment from José, one of our conference participants, which I think really gets at this question that's been coming through a lot of the conversation today about the rhetoric of scientific exactitude, And what I think it speaks to the way that Banham moves across from, speaking as a disciplinarian and speaking as a professional, speaking toward architecture's investment in the arts and its equal investment in the sciences. And so what Joe offers is this. He says, science will risk being dull in order to avoid being wrong, while art will risk being wrong to avoid being dull. On a good day, architecture and its theorizing is both art and science, and neither dull nor wrong, but many days you have to pick your poison. Banham's wrongs have gotten more wrong, at least some of them have, but they haven't gotten more dull. And I think that that's part of what we're wrestling with here today. And I will use that as a place to hit the pause button and hopefully maybe to provoke some of the conversation in our closing comments, which Michael will lead in just a moment. So we'll switch to the next YouTube channel. So for those of you online, just pop over to the next window. We'll need about 5 minutes to reconfigure and get us back up and running. So look for us at about 3:15. So thank you all again for a really provocative presentation. Thank you, Forrest, for typing away in the chat. We'll all be going back to those as well. So see you in a moment.